Now, back live with Jones and Credlin.
All right, thank you for joining us. Now, look, Tony Abbott, I think you've heard of my views on that. You know Peter's views on Tony Abbott. What the public would not know is that he delivered a magnificent speech in May 2005 in which he argued, quote, "It is impossible to say if and when and how a pandemic might develop, but it could be a worldwide biological version of the Indian Ocean tsunami." Pretty prescient. In this speech to an infectious diseases conference on May 2, 2005, Tony Abbott said, "Worldwide Spanish flu killed an estimated 40 million people, compared with 15 million killed in the Great War. Because Australia delayed the repatriation of the first AIF, in part to avoid the flu pandemic, the virus had lost some of its potency by the time it struck here. In the United States, though," he wrote, "where it struck early, it's estimated that the virus severely affected 25% of the then population of 105 million, with 650,000 deaths. Of Australia, at that time," Tony Abbott wrote, "Manning Clark's History of Australia reports that in January 1919, theatres, picture shows, pubs, race meetings and schools were closed until further notice, and the people were advised to wear masks over their faces in public." Wrote Tony Abbott then, Health Ministry was, "Perhaps 12,000 deaths in hospital made comparatively little impact alongside the 61,000 deaths in battle that this young nation had just suffered, even though 60% of the flu victims were aged between 20 and 45. Well, Tony Abbott has just returned from a speech that he made in Japan on the same issue, but it's a contemporary statement of where we are. And basically, he said, referring to what he said in 2005, "Not since World War II have Australians had to cope with very large numbers of premature deaths." He said, this is in 2005, "Australians are unused to contemplating the possibility of death on a massive scale." He said, "It's hard to discuss potential disasters outside people's ordinary experience without generating the sort of lurid headlines which make some scoff and others panic. It's important not to overreact to potential threats," but he said, on the other hand, people in their governments need to take credible threats seriously and take reasonable and proportionate precautions against them. If a deadly flu pandemic, this is in 2005 he's speaking, ever seems imminent, no preparations will be enough. Well, here we are. And bringing things up to the present, the former Prime Minister, as I said, spoke in Japan last week on this very issue, and he joins us tonight, but because he was there, he's in self-isolation and he's on Skype. Prime Minister, former Prime Minister, good evening to you, and thank you for your time. Just go back to 2005. What do you think now when you actually read that speech?
Alan, look, it was good to be Health Minister back then and to have done so much to prepare ourselves back then for a potential pandemic that didn't eventuate. But I think that all of that thinking has fed into the thinking of officials today. That work that I did a decade and a half ago has now been taken forward by others. And while there are lots of things that you could quibble about right now and say, maybe we should have thought about this and maybe we should have thought about that, we are much better prepared than we would otherwise have been because of the work that was done back then in my day as Health Minister.
Peter.
Tony, I'm going to ask you about how, if you were still in the Parliament, let alone Health Minister, indeed Prime Minister, looking at what's happening, particularly in Italy and the preparedness of Boris Johnson. Some would say you do a little bit over time. Others say you need a really short, sharp shock to the system in order that the recovery can happen sooner rather than later. Where would you sit in this now?
Well, the thing that's really harrowing everyone is what's happened in Italy and what now appears to be happening in Spain. And looking at the curve, we're probably 3 weeks behind Italy and we're probably 2 weeks behind Spain. And what we've got to do is try desperately to shut things down in the short term so that we never get into the diabolical situation that Italy and Spain are in. And my instinct is, looking at what's happened in China, that if we do manage to lock things down hard for 4 weeks or 6 weeks, then we'll be in a better position to start to think about whether we can relax things. I absolutely take the point that at some stage in the future, the cure, in a sense, could turn out to be worse than the disease. But at least for the next few weeks, we've got to do everything we humanly can to save people from the kind of predicament that we've seen in Italy and Spain.
Your speech in Tokyo was very deliberate. You said in part that you're still now in quarantine. You said you talked about the health crisis now unleashing an economic crisis, the like of which no one has ever seen. Can we survive such an economic crisis?
Well, yes, of course we can. The point is to try to minimise it, Alan. And what the government is moving towards, I think, is a kind of set of arrangements where, having put the economy, as it were, into a coma, an induced coma, to try to avoid health crisis, they then put the economy on a form of life support so that at some point down the track, hopefully sooner rather than later, it can come off life support and more or less be in the same position where it is now. So what you see in England, as I understand it, is Boris Johnson effectively paying most of businesses' bills and paying most of workers' wages because, let's face it, it's government that's brought on this shutdown. It's not business that's brought on this shutdown. And if the government brings on the shutdown, there's a sense in which the government has to take economic responsibility for it. Very unusual times, obviously, produce very unusual remedies, but no government can be relaxed and comfortable about the prospect of tens of thousands of additional deaths because the hospital system is overwhelmed.
Peter, Tony, you and I have talked about this before, and you've read that speech and so have I, and he made this statement in that speech that there are things we have to learn. And he said, on global supply chains, for a host of products that don't normally seem that important but are suddenly realised to be absolutely critical in a crisis, like the 80% of basic ingredients of all the world's pharmaceutical drugs, and he said there's a lesson to be learnt from this. Now, we've talked about that. This is one bloke who's talking about it, but it is critical, isn't it, the extent to which we are too dependent on other people for things which actually are a source of our livelihood.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Tony, this is the real worry, isn't it, that out of this, we've got to learn, better health preparedness, what more do we need to do with ventilators and preparations for another pandemic, because there will be another one. There's no doubt about that. That's the nature of things. But, Tony Abbott, doesn't this tell us, Australia, we need to be far more self-reliant and put paid to this idea that the world's just a global village?
That's a very good point, Peter. We do have to be far more self-reliant, and what all of this has shown is the limits of globalisation. Globalisation has made it much harder to stop this pandemic. It's spread vastly more quickly than might otherwise have been the case, and globalisation has, in a sense, made it harder to respond to it because what we've discovered is that our supply chains are based in other countries, which are, in many cases, not able to supply us with the things that in normal times we would take for granted. For instance, chloroquine, which we now think might be an effective treatment, or we're thinking could be an effective treatment. The ingredients for chloroquine are mostly sourced from China. Testing kits, we've been desperately seeking tens of thousands more, again, mostly sourced from China. Ventilators, all made from overseas, and Italy, as it happens, has a small ventilator manufacturer, and every single one of that company's foreign orders have been cancelled, as they should be, frankly, to address the domestic emergency. So we do have to be vastly more self-reliant. We have to have readily available stocks of vital raw materials and vital equipment here on shore. And let's hope this turns out to be one hell of a wake-up call.
Yeah, well, Tony, I thought the other aspect of your speech, which was outstanding, and I'm saying to our viewers, Tony Abbott said this towards the end. We should never, ever give up on our ideals, but we need to jettison our delusions. He says it's all very well worrying about potential dangers a few decades ahead, but what if we can't cope with a real danger now. He said it's all very well worrying about the environment of the future, but what if we can't keep alive the people living in it now? As this sinks in, he said, Australia might start building baseload power stations and new dams to stop handicapping our own prosperity. Tony Abbott.
Well, exactly right, Alan. And look, on that score, you and Peter and when I was in the Parliament as well, we've been saying for some time now, these are real, immediate, pressing problems. How can we have a strong agricultural sector without the water to make it possible? How can we have decent manufacturing in this country without the affordable power, which was our only comparative economic advantage? We need to get on with these things because the world doesn't owe us a living. In the end, when it comes to a crunch, the only people that we can absolutely rely upon are ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely true. This is such a lesson, isn't it, Alan? You, I know, have talked a lot about foreign investment. Yeah. I'm all up for foreign investment. But we have allowed foreign investment to morph into foreign ownership and foreign control.
That Peter, the speech ended when he said the necessity for painful choices has once more shouldered its way, this is Tony Abbott, into our consciousness. We'll need to keep it there. The best thing the corona crisis could do is to force us to be relentlessly practical and to stop fantasising that problems will go away of their own accord without effort and sacrifice on our part. Tony, in this environment, you're talking to a lot of people here now. What are the here and now? What are the two things that we need to address?
Well, first of all, we need to do everything we humanly can to minimise the risk to life. And that does mean a sharp close down over the next few weeks. Hopefully, if we do it as thoroughly as we should, it will be relatively short. And then once normal life starts to resume, we've got to avoid the mistakes that we've made far too often over the last 10 or 15 years. And that means indulging ourselves, frankly, on things which in the great scheme of things don't really matter. It's the important things that count. And what's important is having an economy that can sustain us, having a society that is full of self-respect and having human beings who are decent to each other.
Wonderful stuff. Tony, thank you for your time. Thank you for your time. You know what I'm thinking? You know what people out there are thinking? Oh, damn it, I'm going to say what people out there are thinking. They're just simply saying this bloke is a complete waste. The community, the country, the electorate got rid of this fellow. What we need desperately, Peter, today, more than anything else, is someone who can generate ideas and prosecute a case that is relevant to the issue. Abbott certainly can do that. You know that, I know that.
Yeah, look, you'll get no criticism there from me. I mean, when you go back and read that speech from Tony, 15 years ago, he was at the forefront of stockpiling a lot of medicines, setting up a national pandemic plan, setting up a scheme to really lift the number of ventilators in our hospitals, to have a program for immediate border shutdown and for there to be a whole lot of quarantine centres set up for the perfect reason that we've seen in the last few weeks. People get off a bloody plane and they walk away from the aircraft and they go off into the community. They say they're going to do the right thing, but they get hungry 3 or 4 days down the track into 14 days of quarantine and they hit a restaurant and then put everyone at risk. So Tony Abbott, I don't know if he told you, Alan, too, he said when he got off the plane from Japan, he had to sign a bit of paper to say he would go home and do what he's doing now. There was no temperature checks. No one's followed up. He literally walked out of the airport and could have done whatever he liked. And that's the real concern for me even today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You think of that, what Peter said. 2005 he made that speech, Tony Abbott. Amazing stuff. Great Australian. We'll be back after the break with another aspect to all of this.
On Sky News, this is Jones and Credlin.